I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
This is the first episode in a two-part series, and part of our larger season focused on family advocates and the effect of the MMIP, that's Missing and Murdered Indigenous People Crisis, in the United States. This episode discusses domestic and intimate partner violence. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. In May of 2004, Tiffany Reid was 16 years old, and she was finishing out her sophomore year of high school. She was living in Shiprock, New Mexico, on the Navajo Nation reservation. That's where her school, Northwest High, was located too. Tiffany was probably feeling the boredom that bites at so many of us when we're young and summer is on the edge of arriving. Her mother, Deidre, had gotten a few calls from the high school to report that Tiffany had been late more often and was marked tardy for class. Tiffany had made a new group of friends since starting at Northwest. Before that, she'd been at another school, where she lived in the on-campus dormitories available to students. And maybe that's why she'd been more lax about her attendance. There were no signs that anything serious was going on in Tiffany's life that spring. She'd been a quiet, reserved child and teenager. Maybe she was just trying out a little independence. There had been a few instances when she hadn't come home when her family expected her, but eventually Tiffany would call, and she always came home in a day or two. And according to her loved ones, a little teenage rebellion was not a big cause for concern. Tiffany had plans, and she had passions. She had a deep love for her nieces and for animals too. According to People magazine, she was always bringing home stray kittens that she found because she could not stand to leave them outside and vulnerable. Her older sister, Deandra, told the magazine that her little sister dreamed of eventually studying to become a veterinarian. She also had a love for music. She sang and she played the flute, and she wrote poetry too. According to Deandra's interview with People, Tiffany had gotten far enough in one poetry slam competition to travel out of state to compete. As Deandra told us, quote, she was very expressive with her words. So there was really no reason to suspect, and there's still no reason to suspect, that Tiffany Reid ever planned to leave her home for good. Per KOAT-7, Tiffany headed out for school on the morning of Monday, May 17th, at a little after 8:20 a.m. It was like any other day, and the trip was one that she had made 100 times before. According to its official website, Northwest High School is, quote, a tribal grant school located on the Navajo Nation reservation. Although the school offers dormitories for students who might need to live on campus, Tiffany and her mother lived less than a mile away, so there was no need for Tiffany to stay there. Her sister, Deandra, estimates it was a 5 or 10-minute walk from the front door of their home to the school. Tiffany sometimes got a ride from their mother, or from Deandra if she was at the house, but it was not an issue for Tiffany to make the short trip on foot. Perhaps she could have headed to a friend's house first, or planned to go into school late. She had done that before. But her sister Deandra believes that Tiffany's eventual destination was Northwest High School. As Deandra told Dateline NBC, quote, I feel like her full intention was to go to school because she had all the things that she would typically take with her on the school day. And that wasn't all. The sisters had also made plans to meet up in the afternoon. Tiffany had promised to babysit for her nieces, and spending time with them was one of her very favorite things. Deandra had every expectation that she'd see her little sister in the afternoon. But Tiffany Reid never arrived home. At first, the family wasn't too worried because teenagers can operate on their own schedules. But it grew later, and they did not receive a call, letting them know where she was or when she'd return. Back in 2004, Tiffany's mom and sister, they didn't have cell phones. That was not unusual, especially in the early 2000s. As we discussed in our New Mexico season, mobile phone coverage was especially spotty on many reservations where infrastructure just was not addressed. It still hasn't been in some areas. But Tiffany's mom, Deidre, had a landline, and she waited for her daughter to check in. When she didn't, her mother called the school. That's when she discovered that Tiffany had never made it to Northwest High at all. They'd seen no sign of her. No one had. According to Deandra, it was 3 days before her family was allowed to file an official missing persons report. Tiffany was assumed to be a runaway, and Deandra tells us that any searches for her were done by family, who went door to door. Rumors led Deandra on one trail after another, but she never found her sister. Even evidence that turned up a few weeks later, after Tiffany's disappearance, it left the family with more questions than answers. It was not just a lack of support that Tiffany Reid's loved ones faced. Administrative issues, database purges, and massive issues with Tiffany's case file have made her disappear not once, but many times over, in a system that should have been designed to help find her. We met Deandra Reid, Tiffany's older sister, through Becky Martinez. Her brother Calvin was featured in season 19 and is still missing today. Becky and Deandra have known each other since childhood, and they've both faced similar frustrations when it comes to case files and jurisdictional issues. Unlike Calvin, whose case was assigned to the Farmington Police Department, whom we were able to speak with for the podcast, Tiffany's missing persons case was filed with the Shiprock Police Department and is now with the Navajo Nation Department of Criminal Investigations. When we reached out to the current supervisor of the Navajo Nation Criminal Investigations, the office declined to comment, citing the active nature of Tiffany's case, and we were unable to obtain FOIA. So everything that we can tell you about what's happened and what hasn't happened in Tiffany's investigation, it comes down to what her family has experienced, what they remember, and what they've discovered. And that's a lot. It's frustrating for Deandra, though, because she's also uncovered everything that hasn't happened and what should have. We sat down with Deandra early this year for a long interview that she'd had to delay. She'd been out helping search for a different missing person. And this is not the first or even the second time that a family member has had to reschedule for that very same reason. Some loved ones have gone out so often that they tell us that they've sought out task forces and experts to help train small MMIP, missing and murdered Indigenous people, organizations in both urban and rural search techniques. That's because the line between family and advocate becomes blurred. Some, like Deandra, eventually take on official roles with nonprofits to help organize for as many people as they can. Others like Rhonda Grant Connolly and Vanjie Randall Shorty and so many others we've spoken with over the years, they're there too. They'll pick up the phone day or night, and they'll get in the car and they'll drive, hoping that someone else's story will be resolved. Tiffany and Deandra grew up in Shiprock, New Mexico, in San Juan County. It's a Navajo Nation town of less than 10,000 residents, and not far from the Arizona border. Deandra told us about the family and their childhood there.
Our dad's parents lived in Shiprock, but our grandparents from our mom's side, they live in Arizona, a reservation called Cove, which is near Carrizo Mountain, I believe. So Tiffany and I grew up on a farm in Shiprock, and her and I were a part of a big blended family. Our dad was married before he married our mom, and he had 4 kids, which, of course, are our older siblings. And then he married my mom, had myself and Tiffany, and then my mom eventually remarried, and then we have 3 younger siblings. We're right in the middle of our older siblings, and then we have younger siblings. But Tiffany was her and I were the only 2 that shared the same parents. When she was born, I was 4.5. My mom and I were home. Our dad was at work, and I guess my mom was going into labor. She needed to go to the hospital. And so our grandma Reid came down, picked us up, and we just dropped her off at the hospital. And, when my mom was getting out, I remember telling her, if you have a girl, name her Tiffany, because, that big 80s singer Tiffany, she was my favorite when I was little. So I wanted to name her Tiffany.
Many of Deandra and Tiffany's early memories revolved around the family farm, where they were often each other's only playmates, especially when they weren't in school.
It was about an acre of a farm, maybe half. It wasn't like a huge farm, but it was a farm. And we had 3 fields. On one hill we would grow our hay, and then the other would be our vegetables. We had an orchard. We didn't really have much chores around the farm because we were so little, and we were always outdoors together, riding bikes. I taught her how to ride her bike. We had a big tree swing that we were always at. We had a ditch nearby where we used to throwing rocks in. Our dad used to get mad. He'd have to shovel out the rocks. And then we had a big hill behind our house where we would go up and climb up that hill and just, look at all the other farms that were around us. Our closest neighbor was about maybe 1/4 of a mile away. So we didn't really have right next door neighbors where we grew up. And it was just a big wide open area for us to just hang out and entertain ourselves. And we used to like catching frogs. But yeah, that was what we did as a part of our normal childhood when we weren't, indoors listening to all the arguments and stuff that were going on. She was my sister. We shared bedrooms, and a lot of our things we used to do together. She was really into Barbies and stuff, but I wasn't. I was more wanted to play basketball and be outside type. So she wanted to play Barbies, I'd give in and play Barbies with her, even though it wasn't really my thing to do. We were just each other's only friend at that time, growing up, especially during the summer. She was a really quiet kid. I don't know if it's because of all the trauma that, we grew up with, and it just she just shielded herself from everybody. But she was really quiet, so a lot of the time when we were growing up, I did a lot of the talking for her. If somebody would ask her a question, she would whisper it to me, and then I would answer for her.
Before the break, Tiffany Reid's older sister, Deandra, explained that they spent their youth on that small farm in Shiprock, where, for a long time, they were the only children nearby. And that meant that they had to rely on each other, especially Tiffany on Deandra. When their parents fought, or when there was violence in the home, it was a little easier, Deandra told us, when 2 of her older brothers, from her father's first marriage, moved onto the property because the sisters felt like they had some escape.
I want to say maybe a year or 2 before our parents actually really split. Our 2 oldest brothers moved into a house right on the farm. And so they were basically like our neighbors. So after they moved in there, we were there most of the time. When our parents would fight, we'd sneak out of the house and just go run next door to our brothers and just stay there.
But their brother's house wasn't always an option, and Deandra worried about the effect that the chaos at home would have on Tiffany. She tried to protect her from experiencing the worst of it, but Deandra was a child too.
I took care of her quite a bit when we were growing up. We didn't grow up in a healthy environment. There was a lot of domestic violence in our home. And so I tried to shield her from a lot of that. And when we would hear, like, our parents fighting and stuff, I'd put headphones on her ears and play music for her, and just so she wouldn't hear it, because she was still, she was only like 3-4 years old, and by that time I was like 10. And so I always looked out for her when we were growing up. Eventually our parents got divorced and split up, and our mom, you know how they say when the victim or the survivor is trying to leave a relationship, that's really, the hardest time for them to leave. And so I saw a lot of that. When my mom tried to leave, my dad would always track her down and bring her home. And so the last time she finally left, she had to do it by herself and leave us behind. And that was really hard for me, because at that time I was, I think, 11, and it was right at the end of the school year. Our mom used to be a bus driver at that time. And every time she would drive a bus that would come to our school, we would just get on the bus that she was driving and just go home with her. On that day, I saw her and I asked her if I was getting on the bus, and she was like, "No, get on the bus to go home. I'll meet you at home." But she never came back, and that was the time she left. And so that was really hard for me, because I felt like she just left us behind. But now, looking back, I know that was the only way she could do it. And
as Deandra said, she now understands how difficult and dangerous leaving can be. When she was a child, though, she knew only that she and Tiffany were now mostly on their own on the farm.
We were there at the house together a lot of the time, and our dad worked 12 hours, and so, I basically raised her. I don't know where my mom was at that time, but we would be home by ourselves, and I'd have to cook for her and, like, help her wash her hair, and, and then I'd call my grandparents to wash our clothes for us, or if we were hungry and running low on food, I would call my grandma. And eventually she just took us, because we were, basically home by ourselves a majority of the time. And so that's when our grandmother took us in, and we saw more of our mom during that time. But like I said, I was mad at her because she left us, and I just felt like nobody cared about us. It was a really tough time, me coming into my adolescence and, trying to take care of myself and looking out for my little sister. So that was a really hard part of our lives. And then eventually our mom got a place to live, and we went to court at that time, and, the judge, we were old enough to make our own choice where we wanted to live. So we chose with our mom, and that's how we ended up living.
Deandra moved a few times before she even reached high school, first to her grandmother's and then with her mother. That was a stable environment for Tiffany, but Deandra says that she was still dealing with a lot of emotional turmoil from what had gone on, feeling abandoned and not understanding why her mother had to leave in the way that she had. So she decided that she'd be better off staying with other family members. She knew that Tiffany would be okay now that she was in a different environment.
I actually left home when I was about 13. I went to go stay with one of my aunties, and so I transferred to a whole different school, and I basically just left home because my mom and I, we had a really rough relationship, because like I said, I really was upset with her for leaving us, and I just felt like she wasn't there when we needed her the most. we had to depend on each other. And so when we finally moved back in with her, our relationship, it was really rough, and I decided to just leave. So I went to go stay with my mom's sister, and I went to school from there. So ever since I was about 13, I never really was at home. Of course, I would go back like on the weekends and stuff to go be with my sister and just to be home. But for a majority of it, I didn't want to be there. I refused to be there. And my auntie, her daughter is a little older than me, about the same age gap as Tiffany and I, about 4 years. She was going to school in Shiprock, and so she just ended up, basically just taking my place and staying at my mom's. So we kind of just switched places. So she was with Tiffany during that time, during her adolescent years. I didn't worry about her too much because the environment that we were now living in, it was more stable. I would always check on her, like, her grades and stuff, just to see how she was doing, because I still felt that responsibility over her. We were still sisters, and we still talked quite a bit. Even though I wasn't at home, she would call me, and I would call her. So we still communicated pretty often. I just wasn't there physically. And then when I got to high school, I was maybe like a sophomore, and I had a boyfriend at that time. And then when I was about 17, I started staying with him. So I think I was just trying to find my place, just trying to feel loved, or I think I just had like that emptiness in me. And I thought having a boyfriend at a, young age would be that component that would fill me. And so that led me to becoming a young mother. But during that time, he was the one who had the car. And so we would pick up my sister a lot and take her to the movies and go out to eat and hang out. And so that's when I really started to reconnect with her and spend a lot more time with her, was during that time.
Spending time with Deandra during her pregnancy meant that Tiffany got to imagine what it would be like to be an aunt. She couldn't wait for her niece to be born, and she wanted to be there for everything.
She was so excited. She was like, I can't wait till you have your baby. Are you going to come home? You should come home. I miss you. I want to be around her. And I think that's another reason why I went home, so my little sister could have that experience with me, being an auntie and being around my daughter. I wanted my daughter to know who her auntie was, and she was just excited as I was. She was always touching my stomach. She used to like singing, and she would sing to my belly and shake it, and she was already picking on her before she was even born. And then I had my daughter, and then I moved back home to be with my mom because I was a new parent. I was a new mom, and I needed some guidance, and I thought going back home, I don't know how to explain it, but I needed something, but I didn't know what I needed or where I could find it or how to fulfill that need. But when I went home, my baby was like Tiffany's doll. She was always holding her and dressing her and combing her hair. And eventually I left again, went back to my daughter's dad, and then I got pregnant again. So when my second daughter was born, she was still a baby when Tiffany went missing. So she didn't really get the chance to spend as much time with her as my older daughter did. On the weekends, I sometimes would drop my girls off so she could babysit for me while I was at work, because she was always asking for them. And so her and my mom would babysit for me while I was at work. when my girl's dad and I would, be in a fight, I'd go back. I did a lot of back and forth when I was young. I didn't really have any like stability, or like I said, I didn't feel I was looking for something. All my needs weren't being met in some area. And so I think, I read my course with my girls' dad, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go home. Then I go home and it's all good for a while. And then my mom and I would have like a disagreement or something. And then I would leave and go to my auntie's house. And so I did a lot of back and forth when I was young.
Deandra's life was changing, and Tiffany's was too. She went to 2 different high schools, first in Bloomfield and then back home in Shiprock. As she moved from childhood to adolescence, she began to establish some independence, though she was still close to her sister. But like any other teen, she was figuring out who she was outside her family too. She picked up a nickname among her friends, Casey. To this day, Deandra isn't quite sure which friend came up with it or why, but it stuck. It was another little piece of who Tiffany was becoming, and Deandra was not able to keep up with everything that was happening. Her own kids were so young, but she still made sure that Tiffany had what she needed, and that her little sister always knew that she was there.
My sister, Tiffany, she wasn't a loud person. She wasn't like self-centered or conceited or, any of those things. She was, even as a teen, even though she was coming into her own and hanging out with these friends of hers, her voice was just so soft. I think it was really hard for her to trust, and the very few people that she did trust, she was around them quite a bit. And I didn't know too many of her friends. She was going to school in Bloomfield, which wasn't too far from where I was in Farmington. She was staying in a dorm at that time, so since she was a lot closer to me, I would go visit her at the dorm, take her food, just her basic necessities that she needed, and just to visit her. And then I don't know what happened during that time and why she ended up going back to Shiprock. But when she went back, she was at a new school, and all these new friends that she made, I didn't really know too many of them during that time. And the school that she was going to, Northwest High School, they had a dorm for that school also. So I think a lot of the kids that were attending that school were coming in from different parts of the reservation. It wasn't just kids from Shiprock.
When Tiffany returned home to Shiprock and started at Northwest, it was her sophomore year, when she was spending more time writing poetry and developing her love for music, and even traveling out of state to compete in that poetry slam. In many ways, she was doing well, but she was also testing out the limits of her independence. That's where a few incidents that would later have her labeled as a runaway came in. A night or two where she stayed out with friends. But Deandra said that Tiffany always came home, and she always called. She had her own younger siblings by that point, and her nieces, and school. She'd never have taken off for any length of time. She'd go into school late here and there in the spring of 2004, but she had simply not stopped attending. Deandra wasn't living with her mother then, but she was at the home often. Because she worked a late shift at the casino, she'd often catch up on sleep there before going to get her kids. Sometimes Tiffany would go with her after school so that she could babysit. She told us that nothing major had changed in her sister's life, not as far as she knew. Tiffany had not gotten into trouble. She hadn't been acting differently that spring. There was no reason to think that she would voluntarily choose to leave her mother's home or to leave Shiprock.
Leading up to the morning that you came home from work and she was going to be leaving for school, did you have any concerns about her or her safety? Or did you feel like things were just going along as usual?
I didn't have any concerns. I mean, I know that my mom was telling me that she's been going to school late or tardy, that she's been showing up to school, that she's been tardy to school quite a bit because she's been leaving the house late. But I didn't really think anything. I just thought, oh, normal teenager stuff. Don't want to wake up in the morning. But yeah, I came home that night or early that morning after a graveyard shift. I got off at 4 and then I got home like about 5 because the casino I was working at is probably an hour away. And so I was really tired and I just went to bed, and around, I don't know, like 7:30, 7:45 or something, she was trying to wake me up. I could feel her nudging at me, but I didn't want to wake up. And I finally was like, what? She's like, can you drop me off at school? I'm a little bit late. I was like, dude, I'm sleeping, School's just right there. It literally was. It was like a quarter of a mile of a walk, like 5, not even 10 minutes at the most. Maybe even less than that. It was just right at the edge of the neighborhood. And she was like, okay, I'll just walk. And I told her, okay, I'll see you after school. And then she asked me, are you going to be home? I said, yeah, I'll be here. And so, I just kind of waited, and I was wondering, like, okay, well, I guess she's not coming back, because she was supposed to go home with me. And I think she was going to babysit for me. And so I just ended up leaving without her because I had to go to work, and I didn't really think anything of it. I was just like, oh, maybe she doesn't want to go. And then my mom called me the next morning, and she was asking if I heard from her. And I was like, no. She didn't come home from school. She said, no, she didn't come home. She said, I'm going to call the school. And I told her, okay, well, let me know what they say. And I was at work, so I couldn't really talk to my mom at that time. And I finally got done, and I called her back, and she was like, she didn't even go to school yesterday. And I could hear the worry in her voice, like, where could she be at? She never does this. And she's asking me if I knew any of her friends. And I was like, no, I don't really know too many of her friends. And the ones that I did know of, they were kind of like, on the naughty side, like the kids that went out and partied and stuff. And before she went missing, I kept telling her, stay away from them. They're, you have a lot going for you, and don't mess it up. And I was always on her about them because they're older siblings I went to school with when I was in Shiprock. So I kind of knew like their background and stuff. And those were the only friends that I knew of during that time that she had. And after the school verified that she wasn't there the day before, that's kind of like, I need to call the police moment. And when she called the police department, which is Shiprock Police Department on the Navajo Nation, they came out, I guess, and talked to my mom, and they made my sister seem like she's just this troubled runaway girl, They asked my mom if Tiffany had taken off before, and my mom was like, yeah, she has, maybe 2 or 3 times, but it's not something that she did regularly. Like, it wasn't every weekend, or, you know what I mean? I don't want to say that it's normal for her to do that, but it was something that she had done in the past. And so I think just to save them time of not having to do a report, they were like, okay, well, maybe she just ran away and wait a few days if she's not back, and then we'll finish the report or whatever. And so they made her wait 72 hours to file the missing person report. My mom had, during that time, she had just had my little brother. So he was still a baby when Tiffany went missing. And so she was at home with them while I went out looking for my sister. I went to the houses of the friends that I did know, and a lot of them were like, no, I don't know. I haven't heard from her. And, it's just really frustrating because, you don't know if they're hiding them or if they're lying to you. So it was really hard for me to, I guess, kind of determine that. And then when she wasn't back within the 3 days that they told us, my mom went back over there, filed a missing person report, and then a whole week went by before she was put into the database.
After Tiffany was listed as a missing person, Deandra says that the search effort remained limited to their family. She personally drove around between shifts at work, chasing leads that felt more like circles.
I want to say maybe like the first month, I knocked on doors, and then they would say like, oh, I heard she was with so-and-so, and then I'd go to so-and-so's house, and then they would point the finger to somebody else. And so it was a lot of back and forth, and that's kind of how I got to know of the other people that she was hanging out with.
Getting to know Tiffany's friends, though, it didn't give Deandra any solid information on what actually happened to her sister. And as far as the police investigation, Deandra says that she and her mother were not kept up to date as to what, if anything, had been discovered by law enforcement. There were no searches or interviews conducted at that time, not to her knowledge, and we could not verify anything from 2004. Again, the Department of Criminal Investigations, which now has Tiffany's case, declined to comment, citing her case as active and open. Back then, it was Shiprock Police Department that would have had charge of Tiffany's case and any leads that might have come in.
Shiprock Police Department did not keep in contact with us. They did not follow up, nothing. They weren't even looking for her, as far as I'm concerned. I did all of the driving around and knocking on doors myself.
The family kept at it, hanging up flyers and asking questions. There was no word. Not for weeks. Not until a call finally came. They heard that way out on a dirt road in Arizona, on the edge of Shiprock, some items had been found, and it looked like those items had been dumped, maybe out of a passing car.
A couple of weeks later is when they found her stuff on the west side of Shiprock, or like the southwest, going toward the Arizona border, right there. They found her belongings scattered out alongside the road, and I was confused because it's quite a way out from where we live. It was, I don't even want to guess how far it was, but I know it's quite a way out. And I was thinking, why would she be out here, But at the same time, like I said, I didn't really know her new bunch of friends, and like I said, a lot of them come from, different areas of the reservation. And so I'm thinking, like, maybe she's hanging out with somebody who's from that area. Or, I never heard of that party spot. I think just the locals to that area may know that. But as far as I know, I've never been there. I've never seen it. I've never heard of it. So I was a little bit confused as to why her belongings would be way out in that area.
The Navajo Nation's reservation, it's vast. It's the largest in the country, and it stretches over 3 states: New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. All told, that's more than 17 million acres. And according to the Navajo Nation's official website, roughly half its citizens, about 170,000 people, live on the reservation in an area that is roughly the size of the state of West Virginia. To find some of Tiffany's belongings along the Arizona border, it did not necessarily narrow down her family's search. In fact, it left them with more questions. Was Tiffany the one to leave them behind? And when her mother was finally shown the items, the lead became even more muddled, because only some of the things actually belonged to Tiffany. The rest, that's still a mystery. Next time on The Fall Line, Tiffany Reid's story continues. Tiffany Reid has been missing since 2004, and she'd be 37 years old today. At the time of her disappearance, She was 5'3" and 115 pounds, and is described as a Native American female with black hair and brown eyes. Tiffany has a cigarette burn scar on the inner side of her upper arm and a scar under her right eye. If you have any information regarding Tiffany's disappearance, please contact the Navajo Police Department tip line at 928-686-8563 or email tips.npd@navajo-nsn.gov. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure that you're set for automatic downloads so you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case in the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases. It's out everywhere as hardcover, ebook, and an audiobook read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. If you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who have appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance by Melissa Gold, interviews by Brooke Hargrove, produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry, content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.